Good. I'm Larry O'Brien with ARC Advisory Group. I'm on the Smart Cities and Cybersecurity team at ARC. My background is actually more in the heavy industrial sector, process control and process safety, which is not exclusive of smart cities because our definition of smart cities does include smart infrastructure. So things like gas transmission and distribution and water, wastewater, who we actually have a very good end user from that sector here today. So I have a few introductory words, not too many slides. We have two very good presenters, and after our presenters, we're going to have a panel discussion, and we're going to have a couple of representatives from the vendor community on that panel discussion. So I encourage this to be an interactive discussion. I have some questions that I'd like to ask the panel, but I encourage all of you to ask questions as well, and really try to make this kind of an interactive session. But the bottom line, I think, behind the reason for this session is that we realize that smart cities have a cybersecurity problem. I've been covering smart cities for a couple of years now at ARC. I've been to a lot of the industry events and so forth. As a cybersecurity person, it's a bit difficult to get a conversation started about cybersecurity when you're at some of these events and you're talking to the vendors and the end users and so forth. I think it's something that a lot of these people in this sector don't really like to talk about. And if I had to draw some parallels, I think I'd probably go back to the industrial sector maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where we had a cybersecurity track here at the ARC forum for the industrial sector. And in many ways, it was the same. People in the industrial sector didn't want to talk much about cybersecurity. To them, it had very negative connotations about talking about cyber incidents and things like that. It was sort of the thing that people like to whisper to each other, kind of like talking about your sick aunt, in hushed tones. But nobody really wanted to come out in the open and talk about, the serious issues regarding cybersecurity. I think that's kind of where we are right now with smart cities. So our goal here today is to sort of bring this out in the open, maybe elevate the discussion a little bit, create some awareness around this topic and just, have an open and frank discussion. So there's a reason why cybersecurity is a problem in smart cities today. A lot of it's driven by technology changes and technology churn, things like the adoption of IoT, ubiquitous connectivity between devices and systems and even different types of systems being connected to each other. IT/OT convergence, which is something we like to talk about a lot, and some of the things that we run into there, both cultural and technological. In my opinion, the focus on cybersecurity in smart cities today continues to be primarily focused on the IT sector without as much focus on the OT sector. So that's a big problem. We have device-level cybersecurity, which I think is all but ignored in this sector today. Not just for devices that you find in water, wastewater treatment plants like temperature transmitters and pressure transmitters, but also for many of the devices that you see in the city, such as lighting, control systems, environmental monitoring systems, and things of that nature. That discussion also is practically non-existent. We need to do things like ensure things are secure by design. We need to ensure that updates are valid. We need to constrain interactions and operations. We need to monitor systems for abnormalities. There's many things that we need to do in smart cities for cybersecurity. And hopefully we'll talk about some of that here today. I think the other dimension of this also is the organizational dimension, right? And I'm not just talking about IT/OT, can't we all just get along as far as those two sectors go, but also developing things like standard cybersecurity policies, governance practices, having formal incident response plans in place and things like that. So this was a survey that was done by the University of Maryland, which I think, points out some pretty worthy points in that most smart city owner-operators don't have formal written cybersecurity policies or standards in place. According to this survey, only about a third of respondents had a formal written cybersecurity risk management plan in place. About the same amount had any kind of formal written plan for recovery from breaches or an incident response plan. Formal written cybersecurity standards for contracts with the vendors for cloud. Also, you had, the vast majority of respondents did not have a plan in place for that. And even a formal written cybersecurity policy, standard, strategy, or plan. Over half the people that responded to this survey did not have one in place. So to me, that's a bit of a problem that we need to address. We at ARC believe that smart cities are critical infrastructure. They are a very critical part of what keeps our country and really any country moving along. What's happening now is that many systems and interconnections are taking place, right? As more and more systems are being installed and more technology is being installed, these systems are becoming increasingly interconnected. This increases the likelihood that something will be attacked at some point. There is widespread use of citywide open access networks, which increases attacker access to both IT and control systems. The growing use of IoT devices that I mentioned before to improve city processes also increases the attack surface and the likelihood of an incident. Many people and businesses can be impacted by this. The impact of a disruption could be very large, as we saw with the city of Atlanta last year. Customers couldn't pay their utility bills. If you want to have a more extreme example, you can look to the Ukrainian power grid attack, where customers had no power, no heat for quite a long time. So this opportunity for a high level of impact makes smart cities very attractive targets for cyber terrorists or nation states that might want to do us harm, right? And we already know, if you've read things like the National Security Assessment from the US government that came out this January, actually just a couple of weeks ago, they do identify cyber threats to the infrastructure on behalf of hostile nation states as a major threat. So that's something that we need to worry about. But I don't think we need to panic. As I said, our goal here is to raise awareness. It's not to make people panic. I have a slide about IT-OT convergence here, but I think I've already talked enough about that. The other thing I wanted to mention just before we get started is that the nature of cyber attacks is also beginning to change dramatically. So if we want to get some idea of what cyber attacks of the future might look like in smart cities and infrastructure, we can look at what's happened in the industrial sector. So a lot of the attacks that have happened in recent memory in smart cities have involved ransomware, for example, and things of that nature. But what we're starting to see in the industrial sector is actually more sophisticated attacks that have many phases, that might start out with something like a phishing scam that's used to harvest credentials that are then used to gain access to a control system where the attacker might reside and laterally move through the control system for many months or even years before they're discovered or before something happens. So I think, what we can look to in the future is more complex attacks that involve more aspects of the infrastructure rather than, simple ransomware attacks. Not that I'm trying to, diminish the impact of those attacks. So those are my, very brief introductory remarks.